Welcome everyone. I'm Anthony Cook. I'm the head of practice here at Transparity for the Azure practice, and I'll be taking you through this session today. As Danny mentioned, if you can stay on mute, I will stop at certain points just to see if there's any questions in the chat or if anyone's raised their hand. I do usually tend to go a little bit deeper into the tech as we go through this, and as well, we'll be doing a demo. So the way it'll run today is we'll probably spend 20 minutes around the presentation, and then most of it will be done inside of a demo, which is where I expect most of the questions to happen. As you can see from the agenda, we'll start with a bit of an introduction and an overview. We're going to look at some design considerations around resiliency, protecting your data, using things like disaster recovery, the backup functionality inside of Azure as well. And as I've mentioned already, there will be a demo, and at the end there'll be a time for a Q&A. So if anyone's got any additional questions there, feel free to raise those at the end. So, quick introduction really. Traditionally, efforts are made to prevent a system from failing, but in the cloud, you need a different mindset. In a way, really, you need to assume failure is going to happen. And I suppose that's not just in the cloud, actually, that's in traditional IT as well. But there is different mindsets because there's different services and technologies that you can use. And sometimes you can fix that by architecting workloads in a certain way. Whether that's self-healing or the ability to write to multiple locations. This is just not as simply as let's drop a VM and replicate it into another region. Resilience, availability and disaster recovery, things like that need to be thought about right at the beginning when you're designing workloads. Now, a reliable workload is one that is both resilient and available, and resiliency is that ability to recover from failures and continue to function, ideally without anyone noticing anything's happened. Availability is more around, your users can access their workload when they need to. Inside of, there's a framework which Microsoft use, which I've spoken about before, we've had events on, which is the well-architected framework. It's actually a really good kind of place for you to go after this discussion, and it has a lot there around reliability and resiliency. And the way it's looked at from that framework is that there's some design principles that you should focus on, and they are designed for business requirements, which is something we'll go into a little deeper, but what are your requirements? Understand your targets and your SLAs. Design for failure, assume failure is going to happen. Monitor health. So again, there's a lot of new services there. That's very different to the way you may have done this traditionally on premises, but you need to monitor the health of those workloads and those applications. It shouldn't be that it's failed and now you realize and it's failed over. Sometimes you can catch those problems early on and stop it from happening at all. Increase automation. Something we're going to cover today in the presentation and within the demo. Design for self-healing as well. So again, something I touched on a second ago, but when you're actually developing workloads, architecting environments, do that in a way where it's protected and it provides self-healing. And there's also scaling, something again, which we'll demonstrate today. If you distill those down a little bit, distill them down into kind of 4 design considerations. That's how we're going to go through this presentation today, is focus on these 4 design considerations. Really, you need to be thinking about how can I make this highly available? So maintain performance despite a change or a failure in hardware or data centers, for example. Disaster recovery. So how can you protect against a complete loss of a region, for example, or loss of data? Backup and restore. So something that should be part of anyone's, internal process. Technical process, backup and restore. That's obviously very different to what most people are used to, especially on-prem, and the days of running failover tests over a weekend. And again, scaling. So it's these 4 areas we're going to focus on today, and I will demo at least one service within each of those 4 design considerations as well. Before we move further into the technology, before we move further into some examples, one thing you should be aware of, that building reliable systems is a shared responsibility. Customers, partners, they're all responsible for the reliability of that. Some services, Microsoft are responsible for this. Most of them, they are not. It is up to you as a user, as a customer, as a partner, to configure those workloads correctly. Microsoft can hold your hand in some respects, but in others, it's very much down to you. So there is a shared responsibility there. The second thing to think about as well before we look into this is something I mentioned on the first slide, which is, do you understand what you actually want to get out of this in terms of, you may have multiple workloads. It could be internal workloads, or it may be something that you're providing to customers. What are the SLAs that you provide contractually? What are your RPOs or your RTOs or your SLAs, for example? And that may differ. Some workloads in development, you don't have any of that. Not too fussed, maybe just some backups. Whereas others, you may have very strict SLAs that you're providing contractually to your customers. You need to make sure those workloads can abide by those. So, before you jump into the tech, before you start testing some of these services out, understand what are the actual requirements here. And all of that, really, you need to think around how you balance that as well with the obvious cost constraints. As I'll show you today, it is quite simple actually to replicate workloads within a few clicks around the world that can kick in almost automatically when a certain region goes down. But it doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. You could replicate as many times as you want, but there's got to be some balance there between cost and value. And that again is why it's really important that you understand your actual requirements first, because in the likelihood that you've got multiple options, you need to have that information to be able to choose the correct option. So shared responsibility, understand what you actually want to get out of the kind of resilience and the DR, but balance those as well with cost constraints. This is a good image. Some of you would have seen this before. It's used in a lot of literature documentation. I think it's covered in some exams as well. But going back to that responsibility, as you can see there, it's a shared responsibility. Microsoft is responsible for the reliability of the cloud platform, which includes things such as its global networks and its data centers. But there becomes a point where you are responsible. A good example would be, the virtual machines, for example. It is up to you to replicate a virtual machine into another region. And you see there in terms of IaaS, PaaS, and then SaaS, that the virtual machines, you've got a lot more control there in the IaaS column. You've got a lot more control, but that means things like network controls, the application, the identity, that's all on you. All of that's on you. As you move through services such as PaaS, some of this is controlled for you, and we will touch on that, but some of the workloads in Azure, you can simply click a button, or actually they come as standard, natively spread across regions. But still, most of the time, it's going to be down to you to configure a lot of this. But as I'll show you later today, there is ways to automate that configuration, so you can set it once and not have to do it again. So let's talk about availability first of all. Really commonly used services here in terms of availability sets and availability zones. If we are working with customers on production workloads, it is inevitable that they will fall onto one of these services normally. Anyway, especially production workloads. So what do we mean by these? If you can imagine that you're going to configure a virtual machine, when you go to do this, you can choose whether that is going to be spread across availability sets. And the best way to look at sets is it's separate hardware, power, or cooling within a data center. So they're not next to each other. There is separate power and cooling. But if the data center went down, obviously if the region went down, especially, your workload would still go down. But that provides a 99.95% uptime minimum. In reality, we see much, much higher. But that's the minimum that Microsoft promised. And obviously, if that SLA is not made, there is some kind of commercials around that in terms of refunds. But it's actually far higher than 99.95. And that's separate hardware or power. The next step up, something that we see probably commonly more than availability sets, is availability zones. There's a bit of an image there on the right for you, but they are physically separate locations within a region. So essentially another data center. Regions are not made up of one data center. They're often made up of multiple. That will provide 99.99% uptime. And for that as well, availability zones, that can actually be used into some PaaS services, something that will demonstrate. The availability sets are for virtual machines only. Now, let's say we have a workload, we want to make it more available. Regardless of if you use an availability set or zone, actually, this process is still the same. You will go to create that virtual machine, for example, and then you may put one virtual machine in one zone 1, for example, and another one in zone 2. So you've got 2 machines spread across the zones, providing the 99.99% uptime. Now, as you'll be well aware, that's not the end of it. You will need some additional services here when you're doing things like this, obviously. So a load balancer, for example. If you have 2 virtual machines in 2 different areas, you will likely need a load balancer to provide that automation. And if one of them fails, no one even notices because traffic goes to the second. Front door and traffic manager as well. So traffic manager is extremely useful because that can have endpoints that, for example, might be on-prem, in another cloud, whatever. Its endpoints are, it has a lot of various endpoints that you can use. Traffic manager is a load balancer that essentially flips DNS records. So traffic does not go through traffic manager. It essentially flips DNS records really quickly, and that allows you to have workloads in completely different regions. You might have one in UK South and UK West with a traffic manager sat in the middle. Again, the users won't realize which one they're being diverted to. But what I'm getting at is, yes, you could very easily put a virtual machine in a certain zone, but there is often additional configuration. Microsoft have assisted you here a lot recently, especially around virtual machines, because it has some smarts now when you build these virtual machines. And if you want to put them in multiple zones, it will do things like configure load balancers for you. And that's actually the first demo that I'll do today. One last thing to mention, availability zones. For most services, you are selective. So when you go to create a virtual machine or a firewall, for example, it will say, do you want to create one in zone 1, 2, 3? You can click 1, or you can click 2 of them, or you can click all 3, and it will replicate them. There are other services that are zone redundant, which means they are always being replicated across those zones. And again, going back to that responsibility earlier on, that's usually PaaS services where they've taken a little bit of that away from you. And that may be things such as Key Vault, SQL, app services like that. There is a list on Microsoft's website of which ones are automatically kind of zone redundant and which ones are selective, as they call it. So you have to select that. Redundancy. If anyone on this call has ever taken a Microsoft exam, you've probably seen this before because it's one of their favorites to bring up. But I think it's fair that we should look at storage as well quickly before we move on and some of the different options there. So in terms of disks, anyway, you have LRS for managed disks. So that's going to replicate 3 times, again, within that single data center. And then you have ZRS, which is to replicate your managed disks across availability zones. So as I mentioned earlier on, effectively data centers. You can see the SLAs on those there. They're actually yearly SLAs. For some reason, Microsoft use those as yearly and then virtual machines as monthly, but yeah, crazy amount of 9s, really high. You'll see from the bottom, ZRS provides higher availability for managed disks than LRS, obviously. However, there is some write latency. It's better for LRS for obvious reasons. They're a lot closer to each other. It's synchronously writing. So that is something to be aware of. But in all honesty, we work with customers. It depends on cost, the balance, what you're trying to do, what you're trying to replicate. There is other redundancy options for storage in Azure as well, across region, for example. But here I just wanted to cover it based on managed disks more than anything. Scaling. Last time we did this event, we didn't cover this. So I wanted to add it in this time because I think it's important and something we see a lot of, especially at the moment, actually, because it can be useful in terms of reducing costs. And scaling, of course, is the ability of a system to automatically handle increased load. So if you think this time of year, Black Friday, certain websites would have peaked probably the highest they'll do all year. And then after Christmas, settle to a point where it's one of the lowest they may see all year. So scaling is around dealing with those fluctuations in a smart way. traditional IT, you would have a data center or a server room with your business where you would have to have the compute power ready for the busiest days that you've ever had, whereas 95% of the time that computer power is sat there idle. Obviously, one of the big winners for moving to Azure is you don't have to do that and you pay for what you use only. Going back to something I pushed at the beginning of the call, and I'll probably continue to do so, understand your workloads. Understand the workloads, understand the growth, look through statistics, look through planning. Have you got new products that you're going to be releasing this year which could increase that load, for example? But understand your applications, understand which ones can scale and how and when they may need to scale. As I'll show you in the demo, you can scale on different metrics in Azure. Actually, you can do this on custom metrics as well, which opens it up to a lot of things. But CPU, you can do it based on time, date, or a schedule. And of course, you can do it on things such as users as well. So any of you which have been on an Azure virtual desktop event that I did only a few weeks ago, actually, that has auto scaling features, which can be done based on the amount of users on a host, for example. Some of the services, a select chosen few of the services actually, which can use scaling. So virtual machine scale sets provide it essentially scaling up multiple virtual machines. It has to be an identical, obviously, image that you use there, but the ability to grow in virtual machines and come back down on the fly. App service, which I'll demo, the ability to scale there. AKS is obvious. App gateways can do this as well. So if you're sending more and more traffic through an app gateway or load balancer, you may want to look at it. That can scale in terms of its scaling units to make sure it's ready for those loads, because you might have the compute power, you might have 1,000 virtual machines that have just spun up, or 1,000 instances of something else. But if your network or your load balancers or your entry point into that is bottlenecked, then it's kind of irrelevant. So you've got to make sure that you're using your right services there. An app gateway is fantastic for that. It will scale. SQL as well. And I've just mentioned Azure Virtual Desktop, which is a VDI solution. That's some excellent scaling features now, natively built in, whereas previously it was something that you had to do customized. And just before we move on, to the demo, because you'll see some options in the demo around this. When we talk about vertical scaling, we're talking about increasing the capacity. So when we're scaling up, we're looking to increase the capacity of a resource. But if we're looking to say scale out, then we're talking about more resources. So instead of making a virtual machine have more CPU, we would just add another virtual machine and have two of them. And both are available within Azure, and that's why I just want to very quickly touch on that. The Azure Site Recovery, disaster recovery should be part of your BCDR strategy. One of the great services, which has been around for a long time now, is Azure Site Recovery. This was actually used as well and still is really, to migrate workloads into Azure as well, because you can obviously, this is not just Azure to Azure, this is not just region to region, this could be on-prem as well. It could be on-prem workloads that you've got ready set up for DR into Azure, hence why some people have also used it for migrations. Fail it over into Azure, leave it there. There are other tools for migrations, but some people still use it for that. So as it mentions there, some services in Azure benefit from cross-region replication. Some of them do. For example, some of the load balancers do, but most of them require additional configuration, especially virtual machines. And ASR is a service that will allow you to do that. It will replicate virtual machines or physical to another location, but usually a region. Usually you're using this service, ASR, to protect from regional failures. I've spoken about availability sets and zones. So what if a power goes down in a data center? What if a full data center goes down? But if there's a natural disaster, it's very rare that regions go down. I think it's happened in the UK once, maybe twice, and it wasn't really a natural disaster. But you think things like tornadoes especially, you may need that protection. It may be built within your business and a process that you have to have protection into a completely different geographical area. ASR is the best thing for that in terms of virtual machines anyway. It allows you to manage replication, failover and failback. we're going to see that today. And one of the great positives and benefits to this service since day one has been the availability, the ability, sorry, to test without disruption. At the moment, and I know when I've worked for businesses before as well, you may be doing a test failover. We speak to a lot of customers who will admit that they've never done a test failover, don't have it documented, but that may be a really painful process, done out of hours with multiple people. In ASR, you can fail over a machine into another region, but leave the source machine there and the users still go into it. So they have no idea that that failover has happened. So you can test failovers in hours, multiple times a day, until you get it to a point where you know it's perfect. No more do you have to do it at 2 a.m. on a weekend. And I'll actually show you later as well how you can even automate some of those steps. So you may have some additional tasks that you need to do during a failover, change DNS settings, for example. You can start to automate that as well in Azure, which is something I'll show you. It says at the bottom there, just probably quickly, just kind of make you all aware as well. It's got a lot of compatibility. So Azure VMs, physical VM, VMware, obviously Hyper-V, and AWS as well. Other clouds as well. If it can run the agent and it can sync itself up, then it will work. One quick point before I move on to backup around ASR, just to make it clear around how this works. You have a virtual machine in UK South that is your primary region. If you enable that virtual machine for replication, it will not create a second virtual machine in your secondary region at that point. When you enable for replication, it is essentially just replicating the disk. So there is a disk sat in the secondary region. That is what you will pay for, so the storage of the disk, plus there is a price to protect each virtual machine. I think it's something around £11. So what I'm saying is you're not paying for two VMs to run at the same time. Only at the point of failover will Azure very quickly then grab that disk that's in your secondary region, look at the config that you gave it around the virtual machine, and spin it up and create it at that point. So only in a failover scenario would you be paying for then that second virtual machine, the running cost of that machine. When it's not in a failed over state, you're paying a fixed cost to protect it per month, and you're paying the storage cost to hold that replicated disk. It is free for the first 30 days of protection. So you can protect virtual machines in Azure for up to 30 days, test them, fail them over, and it will be free in terms of that monthly protection. You would still pay for the storage, but if you're testing, 10 VMs, looking to fail those over in Azure, if you do it in the first 30 days, it shouldn't cost a lot to try that protection out. So it's just something I want to make you aware of there, is where the costs come from. And then finally, Azure Backup. So obviously a simple solution that can allow you to back up not just Azure services, not just things like storage or virtual machines, but on-premise VMs as well, whether that be Hyper-V or VMware. File shares, Azure, SQL databases, things such as that. It's not just virtual machines. And again, I'll demo this and I'll show you how you can do things like restores. It's great, it scales, it's unlimited data transfer as well. So that's something to be aware of when we're thinking about costs here. You're paying for the storage to store it. That will depend on your retention policies and how often you're backing up. But some of you will be aware, bandwidth in Azure is charged for. However, when it's Azure backup, even if you're backing something up from on-prem, for example, the data transfer there is not charged. Which is good, because if you're quite large backups, that could get quite expensive. And as you can see there as well, it's not just around retention policies, but also you have redundancy options. So you may want that backup to be GRS. You may back up something in UK South where the backup's been stored, regional, globally with GRS. So, and the second thing, which is a little newer, I suppose, and I'll show some of it before you. VM archive storage tier, so cheaper storage for backups that you're going to retain for a longer period of time. Some new monitoring capabilities, and also the ability to have multiple backups per day for Azure files. I've done this event before about 2 months ago. So where it says our newly released features, they've been around for a couple of months now, but that's still fairly new. But they are out of preview. Finally, around the tech, really, before I get into a few tips before we go to demonstration, you can automate a lot of this using policy. Azure Policy is a service that evaluates resources, gives you a view of compliance based on the kind of rules, and can do things like actions based off the back of that. So if you think of group policy objects on-prem, it's a little bit like rule sets. So are Azure policies. You may set a rule that states workloads can only reside in UK South for GDPR reasons, for example. Users can only create VMs of this size. They can't create some beast that's going to cost us £2,000 every hour. And some of those built-in rules are focused around BCDR, and I'll demo them, but you could see here, Azure backup should be enabled for virtual machines. You may enable that policy, and then after that point, whenever someone goes in and creates a virtual machine in Azure, they don't need to worry about DR, because that rule set will see it. And if it's not set up, it can actually go and do it for you. Same as the second one down there with a specific tag, something we do a lot of with customers. You know, do you have different backup schedules, different backup retention policies based on the certain workload? Probably. What are they? Do you have different retention policies for, say, a dev workload compared to production? If so, do it based off of tags. You know, if a virtual machine is tagged with dev, set it up for this backup procedure. If it's prod, do it this way. But again, it's automating the process. You can enforce redundancy. So, for example, you could say storage accounts must use GRS, or they must use another form of redundancy. But also, it can be used to set up these features. So configure DR on virtual machines using Azure Site Recovery, that should say. So again, the ability to create that policy. You might base that on tags as well. You might base it on a tag that states DR required. When you create a VM, it asks you, is the DR required? You say yes. The policy sees that tag and then sets it up for DR automatically for you. So I push policies probably on every event I do. It's a free service, very powerful, not seen in other cloud providers, and they are adding more and more policies built in BCDR, which is why I wanted to mention it. Some of them are still in preview, and you can make custom policies, but Microsoft seems to have a bit of a focus at the moment around some of these, so I only expect to see that policy set grow from here on out. So before I stop with the slide, we'll move on to some demo, some tech, just some quick planning and tips really to go over some of the things we've already spoken about. Define your availability and recovery targets to meet business requirements. So understand what your requirements are, understand what your targets are. Design the resiliency features of your applications based on those requirements. Don't just go replicating workloads all over the place for no reason. Again, think about cost, think about balance. Align those applications and data platforms to meet those requirements. Configure connection paths to promote availability. Think about how your applications are connected. Use zones. Zones is really simple. I'll show you on demo. Yes, there's a cost implication there, but if you're wanting that 99.99% minimum, zones is a great way to go about it. Really simple to set up. Make sure your application architecture is resilient to failures. If your application doesn't do things such as retries, as soon as it hits an error, it just stops, blocks. Doesn't matter how many times you replicate it, how many times you want to put load balancers in front of it, if it can't handle those type of things. So it's important, and don't get me wrong, I'm not an application developer, but it does need to be thought out literally at the very start of any workload or application. Think about resiliency. What happens if an SLA isn't met? You know, is that commercial problems for yourselves? Are you going to have to pay someone? Is there a fine? Are you offering products to customers? It really ties into one of the top ones around understanding business requirements, but know what happens if an SLA isn't met. And then identify possible failures. You're only as strong as your weakest link. We have done real life projects with customers that obviously I won't mention names, large customers, dealing with sensitive information, where we were asked to review an environment to make sure that it was reliable. It was replicated all over the place. It was using Kubernetes. It was all over the place, but it had one dependency, which was a machine on-prem, a single machine. So this had been replicated all over the place in Azure, paying crazy amounts of money. But if I walked into that on-prem and switched off that server, it was all irrelevant. So you're only as strong as your weakest link. Think about possible failure points. If you're running hybrid, which a lot of people on this call are, and a lot of people will continue to do so, that is the trend that we see. Think about that as well. Obviously, it's a lot easier if everything's in Azure, but if you've got workloads that are running some in Azure and some on-prem talking to each other, you need to think about that in terms of reliability. Are there any questions before I jump into a demo, Danny?
No, we have no questions at the moment.
Okay, so let's jump into a demo. I mentioned availability zones and I mentioned virtual machines. So I'm going to show you that now around how simple that can be. Let's say you've got, we'll keep it simple. Let's say you've got an IaaS workload, a website that's running on a virtual machine, and you want to make sure that it's protected from data center failures. You need that 99.99% SLA. So you need to create 2 virtual machines in different zones, and you'll need a load balancer to do that. So something that's fairly new inside of the Azure portal is the ability to do that now from within one screen. So if we were going to create a virtual machine, and in art attack fashion, I've done some of these earlier, so I'm not going to go all the way to the end. But you'll see here, we choose our region, it's UK South, and then it's saying your availability options. What do you want? Do you want a zone? Do you want availability set, or do you want a scale set in terms of scaling? I want a zone. As you can see here, you can now select multiple zones and it will create a VM per zone. If I select 1, 2, and 3, you couldn't do this before, you have to go around and create them. It will even change the names for you. You can edit this, edit these names, for example, but it's going to make 3 identical virtual machines just by going into the screen and looking to create one of them. Operating system, really, in terms of what I'm talking about here, is irrelevant. And then if you've been through this process before, you give it things like username and password. I'm going to skip, and I'm going to skip to the networking part because it has seen that you're creating multiple virtual machines now. It can see that they're across availability zones. So what you can do is just down here, either select a current load balancer, which I do have, or just create a new load balancer. Again, they will be automatically added to the back end of that load balancer. So within one screen, you create 3 VMs with a load balancer in front of it. Set up the usual information that we don't need to go over today. Management, identity, monitoring, for example. You get to the end, you create them, and it will do it for you. An example being this virtual machine here, UKS 001, is currently sat in availability zone 1, and I have a 02 virtual machine, which is sat in zone 2. So they're in the zone. I'm getting that 99.99% protection. And also, if I go to the networking tab here, I go back to load balancing. You can see it's part of that backend pool. This is the IP address that I would go to get to those those 2 machines. Sorry. So really simple, especially in terms of virtual machines. Really easy to test, get up and running. If you use sets or if you use zones, you're using multiple machines. So, in this case, outside of, say, a disaster recovery scenario when using ASR, if you create 3 VMs in 3 zones, you're paying for 3 VMs in 3 zones at all times. So that's something that is something to be aware of. And very quickly, just as another example, so we don't focus too much on VMs, there's a lot of services where you can be selective with the zones. Another really common one which we work with would be firewalls as well. So if I go to the create a firewall screen, you can see here, again, you might want to spread those across zones to give yourself that that protection. And that's what I meant earlier on around, if you've got if you've got all these virtual machines that are all talking to each other through a firewall, they're spread across loads of zones, but then you've got a firewall that's in one. It doesn't matter that your workloads are spread across different data centers. If your firewall that everything's routed through is only one of them and that goes down, you're only as strong as your weakest link. So think of every part of an environment. That's why we always say think about it when you're designing an environment, not later, ideally. So that's availability zones. That's a way of showing you that it's very, very simple to set up. Okay. Next thing. If we go back to, let's go to virtual machine 1. Backups. All of these type of BCDR stuff you'll always see for virtual machines anyway under the operations blade on the left. So we've got backup and DR here. I'm going to show you backup and what you'll see for backup on a machine that is not being set up. So with backups or ASR, it requires a service called a vault. The vault is where it's going to store this data for you, separate to normal storage. So if you're creating backups from scratch, you would have to select, you'd have to create a vault. I actually already have one, as you can see here. And then you can choose some different policy types. You can edit these at a later time. You can modify them. You can add new ones. This is kind of a quick way of setting it up from the VM screen. But you could go standard, once a day backups. Vault here is going to be ZRS, for example. And then you've got the enhanced, which really is around multiple backups per day. Which again is a fairly new feature. Very quickly though here, there's a default policy as well. So I could leave it on standard. Default policy is this policy here. I could create a new one. You usually would. I wouldn't expect anyone to click default policy when you're Azure. Everyone's got different requirements around, but you can see here the policy in terms of how often is this going to be backed up, when, how long you're going to retain instant recovery snapshots for, and then retentions. And again, every business has completely different rules around this. Are you actually retaining your yearly backups, for example? If you have long-term retention as well, you can enable tiering, which is something I mentioned earlier on. I'm moving it to an archive tier storage, which is the cheapest type of storage in Azure, because it is expected that you don't really need to access it a lot, but you'll get a lot of cost savings there in terms of storing that data. It's as simple, if you were going to do it on a VM by VM basis, which I wouldn't advise, it's as simple as going to this screen, leaving all of these as standard really, and pressing enable backup. And it'll crack on and do your backup for you. If we have a look at Backup Center, something that I've already set up. So I have a machine already that's been set up for backups, 003. And I can see this here for my backup instances. I might want to add something to this. I might want to back something else up, SQL in Azure VM, for example, Azure Files, blobs, database. The list will continue to grow, I assume, but it's not just virtual machines, but it's what I've used as an example. If we go to this backup, we can see information that you'd expect to see. Pre-checks have been passed. When was it last run? What's our kind of snapshot time? When can we pull it back to? And you'll see across the top as well. You could run an ad hoc backup if I wanted to, but I won't slow it down for now. I could restore. And one thing to be aware of here as well on the restores is this can be quite useful for testing. You can create a new virtual machine off the back of that, or you can restore the disks. So you may want to restore just the machine that's there already. You may want to create a new virtual machine. This is something that we see quite often in terms of we want to test something. Let's take a snapshot of this machine, go and test it. You can do it that way. It's not always just a restore of this that you can do there. Also, probably more useful when you're backing up some on-prem workloads, but file recovery. So you may just want to go in and grab a file. You can think of some of the workloads already in your head that you could be backing up here, but it may just be a file that you want to get back. So in that case, you'd pull this full backup, and then essentially you will get a script that you download that will map it, the file directory of that backup, to your machine. just in network mapping basically. And then once you've got the files that you need, you can just unmap that and carry on. So you could spend quite a lot of time on Azure backups, to be honest, especially Backup Center, because it's changed now. We've got this all-encompassing view now, Backup Center, so you can see across multiple subscriptions. We work with customers that might have 20 subscriptions. You can now see backups across them all, which is great because normally enterprises of that size would normally have, whether it's us as a partner or internally, someone to actually look at things like backups. They have their own team, so having that single pane of glasses has been a great improvement for Microsoft, to be honest. So I'm going to go back to my trusty virtual machine. Go to number 3. Let's say I want to replicate this machine. I want to use ASR. The prereqs to this is a vault created. That's it. And I'm going to show you how you can set it up in a fairly standard vanilla way, about how simple it is to test ASR and multi-region replication. So this is my virtual machine. I'm going to come back down to the operations and go to disaster recovery. There's that in there. You don't want to do this between availability zones. You can do that now. So if you've got them in availability zones in one, you could move it across to another. No. What's my target region? So in this case, I'll go for UK West because it's currently in UK South. And it actually shows you there on the map, although they're basically next to each other, where that's going to be replicated to. You can actually just do that and press start replication. If you want to do some testing, why not? But you can look at some of the more advanced settings. And the advanced settings are things like, what resource group do we want that replicated machine to be in once it's on the other side? What network do we want it to use? So if you've got multiple networks or hub and spoke networks, you're not going to use the defaults here. If you've got what I've got in my demo, which is just a single network in one region and a single network in another, I could have probably got away with just all the defaults. But again, things like how you're going to pin your availability sets, what are your storage settings going to be? You may have premium SSDs in your primary region, but you might not want to use that in a secondary failover. You might want to save costs in a failover, so you can change things like that. Replication settings as well in terms of the retention policy. But you can just go to basics, change it to UK West, and press that button, and it will replicate. Once it's done that, it will look like this. VM1. You'll see this instead. So as I mentioned to you earlier on, it's replicating disks. So if you see here, UK South, this is our primary region. So we've got the virtual machine and everything that has, its disk, for example, its memory, CPU, and we've got this cache storage account. And what's happening here is, like I mentioned earlier, it is replicating using the vault in UK West to a disk. It's not another virtual machine in that region. If I press test failover, it will now fire up a second VM in that region. So it's asking me to check everything here. It's asking me to look at my recovery point, things like that. What network am I going to test this over to? And then you could run that DR and you'll now see it really happen. That's a simple way of doing it. That's a simple way of me saying, look, here's one virtual machine. If you want to test DR into another region, this is how you can do it. One quick thing that we should look at before we end is something that will be more realistic in the real world, which is you're not going to be failing over a single virtual machine. There's actually a chance that there's going to be multiple. And in traditional failovers, that's difficult. You have to have it documented. Which one do we bring down first? Do we bring a domain controller up first? Whatever that may be, SQL before its front end, whatever you may do there, there's normally an order in which you want to do things. So what you can also do using site recovery is use something called a recovery plan. And what you can do with a recovery plan is tell it when it's going to recover certain machines and at certain times, for example. So in this recovery plan, it takes both of my machines that I'm currently replicating and will shut them down, and then it fails them over. You can add things to this. You can add automation to this. When you run through your first failover test, you may go, oh, there's a DNS setting there that I needed to change. There's an AD setting, there's something that I need to change, and you use PowerShell. You can get those to trigger automatically as it's going through a failover by creating groups, by adding things to those groups. As I say, adding anything really, actions, post actions. A really common one we see is, so you see here around scripts, but a really common one we see is, for example, maybe you have to go to a third-party DNS provider to make a change. Maybe you're in a situation, which is common, that it can't all be done end-to-end in Azure. But instead of having that documented somewhere in a Word document where no one wants to read it, you can actually create that manual action in this recovery plan. You can have it in your recovery plan where you say there is an action, a pre-action, for example. It's a manual action. Let's see, change DNS, whatever that may be, and the actions. And as a failover is run, it starts to do those machines. When it gets to that point, it will pop up on the screen and say, this is what you need to do before we can move forward. So recovery plans are great. You can basically create your failover plan within this, see all the steps within there, add automation, PowerShell, things like that, and let it do it all for you. And one thing you may have noticed there before we finish on the demo is the test failover had been completed. So what we would usually see, now that there. So that test one is now running in UK West. I am now in a failover scenario, so I'm now paying for both at the same time. If I fail back, it'll disappear and it'll be going back to one again. So the last thing, here's Azure policy. Definitions. I just wanted to show you some of the examples that I mentioned earlier on. We work a lot with businesses around using these, not just around BCDR, by the way. If you've got a presence in Azure and you're on this call and you're not using Azure policies, I'd advise you to look into it. Can make you sleep a lot better at night having these type of rules set and knowing that people can't do certain things. So if we see here, audit virtual machines without disaster recovery, test the business continuity and disaster recovery plan, configure DR on virtual machines by enabling replication. So this is what I mean. You could enable that, give it some options and say only do it on machines that we call production. And then going forward, someone in your team could go and create a virtual machine and it'll set it up for DR automatically. Again, you can use policies to do that across multiple things. Transparity uses that to do things like monitoring. So if you're part of our managed services, we can do things where you don't have to worry about is it being monitored when you add a new virtual machine. You just worry about creating your workloads and use policy to go, oh, someone's just created a virtual machine or a SQL database. Set it up for backup, set it up for security and so on. So it's not just about knowing the services you've got available to you, but automate them as well. Okay. And I'm going to leave it on this screen here, which is around a free of charge workshop. It's around a well-architected workshop because the well-architected does look at reliability along things such as cost optimization and security. We are offering a half-day workshop there around that subject. Danny, is there any questions, buddy?
We have no questions.
Okay.
No questions. But if anyone does have any questions now or wants to stay on at the end of the call, wants to ask Anthony anything, feel free. Feel free to reach out at any later point as well, whether that be to Danny. If it's a difficult one, go to Danny. If you've got a nice question, feel free to reach out to me, whether that's through LinkedIn or any other method, really. We are open, not just on this call, and we're always happy to have a discussion as well. Excellent. All right. Thanks very much. Thanks to those who've just dropped a few thank yous in the chat. If there's no other feedback, then we will close the session today. And like Anthony says, if you've got a direct contact Transparity already, feel free to reach out to them or just come back into the chat and contact one of us directly, and we can help out. Thanks very much. Thank you. Cheers.